Witchwater by Phyllis Reynolds Naylor, Chapter 6. Autumn died, and the nothingness of November took its place. The trees, which had been bushy with clumps of red and gold a few weeks earlier, stood bedraggled with a dry, colorless leaf here and there. Heaps of dead leaves, rotting from the rains, covered sidewalks and lawns, and the fields, which had blazed gold under the October sun, were now brown and nondescript. Everything seemed to have turned gray, the streets, the trees, the houses in the dark November light, and most of all, the sky. Lynn made a determined effort to be natural and cheery when she was around her parents, to cause them no concern, avoiding all hints that she was worried. She went to school each day, ate a snack when she got home, did her math, and went out walking with Mouse, arriving home in time for dinner, full of talk about how her teachers and studies, and how she was doing in gym class. Her parents were relieved. So thorough was her act that one evening her father forgot his own precautions and said to his wife, They turned the matter of the missing death certificate over to the sheriff for a routine check." Lynn didn't respond at all. "I'll have another piece of pumpkin bread," was all she said, seeming to have ignored the conversation altogether. As father passed the bread, he couldn't help but say, "You seem more yourself these days, Lynn, as if you're not as worried as you used to be." "About Mrs. Tuggle?" Lynn said casually. "I'm too busy at school to even think about her." "That's my girl," father said jovially, and exchanged a relieved smile with mother. Great, thought Lynn. At least her parents wouldn't have to quarrel about her anymore. At least one good thing was happening. At the same time, Lynn wondered if mother was completely convinced at the change in her. She noticed that Mrs. Morley was watching her more closely than usual, studying her reactions, for example, if a tree branch scratched the window or a crow cawed outside. Lynn knew she was being observed and pretended to be startled at nothing. Inside herself, however, Lynn was shivering with fear, was shriveling with fear. The 9 crows continued to hover, and the bare November trees made their presence even more noticeable. One afternoon, as Mouse walked home with her, Lynn felt that the crows were so obvious, following along overhead, that anyone who happened to look up would not fail to notice them. If only Mother was watching at that moment, she would see them too. Maybe, just maybe, if they were still there when they reached the porch, she would tell Mouse to wait outside and go in herself and have Mother look out. Just as they reached the steps, however, Mother came out on the porch with Stevie, and the crows silently winged their way on over the house and out of view, as though controlled by a lead crow who was half human. Even worse, Stevie had taken a liking to Mrs. Tuggle's cat, despite being punished for having followed it down to the creek. Sometimes, when Lynn came home from school, she found him sitting on the front steps, stroking the big animal. "Look what I found, Lynn," he said one day, his face round, beaming with discovery. It's a necklace on the cat," he exclaimed it carefully. "It looks like a spider, so that's what I'm going to call this old cat. Spider. Isn't that a good name?" Lynn stood on the sidewalk facing the cat. It stared back, its tail swishing. "That's an excellent name, Stevie," she said. "It fits perfectly." "Yeah, 'cause some spiders are brown, aren't they?" "Yes, and some are cunning and crafty and poisonous." "You don't like spiders, do you, Lynn?" "Some of them I don't." She walked up the steps, and as she passed, the fur on the end of the cat's back rose stiffly, ruffling thickly about the neck, and then lay flat again when the front door closed behind her. Lynn watched it through the window in the music room. Was it possible that the animal was half human, and inside the skin and fur there was a remnant of a human brain that had been programmed against her? Cat and mouse. The phrase stuck in her mind, and she couldn't rid herself of it. Her hands grew cold. Marjorie was no match for an animal like this one. Not now, especially. Things were going worse for Mouse every day. The gym teacher had scolded her just that morning because she hadn't pressed her gym suit. "It's a wonder she's even wearing a gym suit at all," Lynn had thought to herself, wincing at as the teacher's harsh voice rang out over the gym. "If the teacher knew how many times I've reminded Mouse to get that suit washed and back to school on time, she'd go easier on her." She wondered if she should talk to the teacher later about it and tell her the problems Mouse was having at home, but she knew she couldn't go on forever offering excuses. Eventually, Marjorie had to face the fact that her mother probably wasn't coming back, no matter how much she loved Mouse. In the meantime, Lynn had to fill in and be the best friend she could. What Mouse needed help with most at the moment was a science project. Everyone in class had to collect 20 specimens of common weeds and identify and label them. Lynn had managed to collect a dozen just by keeping her eyes open on the way to school, but Marjorie's eyes were on the trees, not the ground, and she hadn't even started the project. So on this particular afternoon, Lynn suggested they go out in the meadow after school and collect the specimens together. About 4 o'clock, they headed across the meadow with a paper bag between them, following the creek as it wound around between the old cemetery on the one side and the hill on the other. "You know what, Lynn?" Mouse confided as they tramped through the crisp brown grass that crackled underfoot. "Last night I dreamed that I ran away, and when I woke up this morning, it didn't seem like such a bad idea." "That's dumb, Mouse. Where would you go? Cincinnati, maybe, to live with Mother?" "If your mother thought that was the best place for you, she would have taken you there. But maybe if she knew what was happening to me here, she'd let me stay with her." "She might." Lynn fell silent. "But your father would be frantic," she said finally. "He'd have everyone in the whole Midwest looking for you." "I could hide out," Mouse offered. "Freight trains and stuff." Lynn tried to imagine it. Lost, one short girl, straight brown hair, large glasses, skinny legs, dressed in yellow jeans and a huge purple poncho. Anyone who saw Mouse would never forget her. "What if the crows came with you?" "Oh, Lynn, don't say that." "Well, don't talk about running away then. I'd miss you like anything, and your dad would go nuts. You just might move a whole pack of trouble to Ohio along with you. We'll stick it out together. As long as you keep that ring on your finger and stay away from Mrs. Tuggle, I don't see how she can really do anything. After a while, she'll figure out she's not getting anywhere and give up, like she did with Judith, especially now that the sheriff's investigating the death of her brother. Not that he'll find out anything, of course. But it just might make her more cautious. After all, she's not about to come knocking on your door and just snatch you away." Lynn knelt down and removed a cocklebur from her sock, dropping it into the sack. They had already picked up some thistle, some dock, and a few pieces of Indian mallow. Mouse saw some milkweed growing halfway down the bank by the creek, stepped over the edge, and reached down. There was a sudden sound of footsteps behind them. Lynn looked around. Mrs. Tuggle was walking straight toward them, in big, steady strides, her face intent, eyes glimmering, her thin lips quivering slightly, holding a heavy stick in one hand. Where she came from, Lynn did not know, unless she had been hiding somewhere in the bushes. "Mouse!" Lynn cried out as the old lady came at them. Marjorie lifted her head just as Mrs. Tuggle reached the bank. She gave a little cry, lost her balance, and tumbled backward into the swirling water below. It happened so quickly that Lynn did not see Mouse tumble into the creek until she heard the splash. "Mouse!" she screamed, dropping the sack and scrambling down the bank sideways. Below in the water, Marjorie struggled to get her head up, arms flailing, legs kicking. It was here that the current seemed to move in circles, that a mist rose up from the surface of the creek, and here that the water was deepest of all. Lynn did not know whether Mrs. Tuggle was coming down the bank behind her or not. She could only think of reaching Marjorie. But by the time she got to the water's edge, Mouse was upright once more, clinging to the roots of a tree that projected out from one side. At that moment, Mrs. Tuggle's voice sounded in the air above them. Lynn looked up. The old woman stood, holding the stick out over the water. The lead crow from the 9 in the trees overhead had flown down and was perched on one shoulder. Mrs. Tuggle's eyes, small and terrible, were fixed on Mouse, and she was mumbling something that Lynn could not understand, words of another language, Hebrew perhaps, or Greek, and then suddenly she reached down and held the stick out towards Mouse. "Here, my girl. Catch on and pull yourself up before you catch your death," she clucked. "My goodness, 2 girls out and about without watching where they're stepping." Spluttering and still dazed by the stumble, Mouse grabbed hold of the stick and Mrs. Tuggle hoisted her up the bank. Lynn was amazed at the old woman's strength. She leaped up and pulled Mouse away. "Come on, Mouse. Let's get you home so you can change." "I have a fire going in my parlor," Mrs. Tuggle crooned, ignoring Lynn. "Come on to the house and dry yourself, my dear, and a spot of tea would be good for you." "No, thank you," Lynn said coldly, tugging Marjorie's arm. Mrs. Tuggle slowly turned and faced Lynn. "Has the girl no tongue to answer for herself?" "No, the cat's got it," thought Lynn, but she said nothing. She had one arm around Marjorie's shoulders and was leading her away. She could feel Mouse trembling and walked on faster. The crows overhead flew lower than usual, cawing raucously, their shadows spotting the ground. When they had left Mrs. Tuggle far behind, Mouse's head flopped over on Lynn's shoulder. "I feel so tired," she said, "like I can hardly walk. All of a sudden I feel weak and sleepy, as though I just don't care about anything." "You've probably got a chill," Lynn said, not believing it herself. They walked on, but Marjorie's feet dragged, and she leaned heavily against Lynn. Something seemed to have happened to her back there. Was it the incantation Mrs. Tuggle had intoned over her when she fell in? Was it a power of some sort transmitted through the stick that Mrs. Tuggle had been carrying? Or was it all psychological? "That was no accident, Mouse," Lynn said at last. "She wanted you in that water. Maybe she wanted both of us to fall in. I don't know. I can't say that she pushed you. I can't say that she pushed us, but it was the next thing in." "Yes," Mouse said weakly. "It's the water, I'm sure of it. There's something in the book about bodily transformation, something about a person being dipped in water or milk before they could be turned into anything else. Well, I was sure dipped, but I'm still me, I think." Lynn frowned. "Did you remember that it's creek water Mrs. Tuggle uses for her tea? She told us so, and remember how sleepy you got the first time you drank it? Oh, Lynn, if she's got the whole creek in her powers, how can we fight it? She could get half the town under her spell just by scaring people into falling in." Lynn tried to laugh it off. "I'm sure it would take more than that, Mouse. Remember what you said about having to want the power of witchcraft more than anything else at one particular moment? Most folks, when they fall in a creek, want more than anything else to get out, that's all." But inside, Lynn felt sick with fear. Maybe the effects of the water would show up right away. Maybe first it was tea, then a dip in the creek, and slowly, bit by bit, Marjorie's will to resist would be washed away until she was willing to do anything Mrs. Tuggle required of her. Suddenly, she remembered the ring. "Mouse," she cried, "have you still got the ring?" Mouse made no move to lift her hand and see. She hardly seemed to have heard. Lynn grabbed her hand and looked. The ring was still there. She felt weak with relief. When they reached the Beasley house, Lynn helped Mouse get out of her wet clothes and crawl into bed. "I'll go back and get that sack," she said. "We only needed about 4 more specimens, and I'll pick those up on the way home. Come by the house tomorrow about 20 minutes early, and I'll help you label yours. Okay, Mouse? Are you awake?" "I'm awake," came a voice from under the covers, but it didn't sound very awake. Lynn went outside, making sure that the front door was locked behind her. Then she cut back to the meadow again, picking jimson weed, toadflax, and goldenrod as she went, retracing her steps along the creek till she caught sight of the paper bag down near the water. She had just climbed down to get it and was turning around when a shadow fell over her. Thinking Mrs. Tuggle had come back again, this time for her, she jerked her head up, but saw instead of the old woman the 9 crows like a dark cloud circling overhead. She hugged the paper sack to her and climbed back up the bank, walking rapidly once she reached the top. When she came to the footbridge, she crossed the lowest part of the creek. She almost ran across it and up through the field in the direction of the Morley garden. There was something different about the crows now. They made no noise at all, no cawing, no loud flapping of wings. Only the dark shadow that fell on the ground before her reminded her that they were there. And suddenly they swooped, like fighter planes. Plunging from the sky, they came at her. The lead crow sailed by, his wingtips grazing her cheek. On all sides she could feel birds passing, feel the sting of their slashing wings on her arms, hear the whistle of the wind as they flew past her ears. As she turned to see if they had gone, she saw them forming again, and again they attacked, their bodies closer still, like angry missiles hurling themselves at her back. Screaming with fright, Lynn fell face forward on the ground and covered her ears with both hands. She was sure she would be killed. They would rip her flesh to shreds, just as the cat had ripped the book on spells and potions. But they did not come again. Instead, they rose in the air, cawing raucously in unison, like demons shrieking compliance to an unseen master. And Lynn slowly turned to watch. And as Lynn slowly turned to watch, they fell into place behind the lead crow and made their way to Marjorie's again to wait. For a few moments, Lynn did not get up. She was trembling so hard she was not sure her legs would move. It was not just Mrs. Tuggle whom the girls were fighting, but the crows and the cat as well. Mouse talked as though she had already given up, as though it were useless even to try. For a brief moment, Lynn felt it too, felt how easy it would be just to go to Mrs. Tuggle's and drink her tea and do whatever she asked of them. No more crows following them from tree to tree. No more cat prowling about in the house. No fuss, no worry. Simple, mindless robots who did as they were told. As the shivering stopped, however, she realized that this kind of thinking played right into Mrs. Tuggle's scheme. It wasn't Mrs. Tuggle's stick or her incantations that were so powerful, but the fear they produced. Once the old woman had paralyzed her victims with terror and trembling, she could make them do whatever she wanted. Lynn pulled herself up quickly and walked the rest of the way up the hill to the house. She wasn't about to give up yet. The harder the old woman fought, the harder she would resist. "What happened?" Mother said, turning around as Lynn passed her in the hall. Lynn stopped and looked at herself in the mirror. There were strange marks on both cheeks where the crow's wingtips had grazed her. Pieces of grass and weeds were sticking to her hair and on her jacket. How Lynn wanted to tell her, how she longed to throw herself in her mother's arms and tell her she was frightened, to beg for protection, but how would she ever be believed? How could she honestly say Mrs. Tuggle was responsible for Marjorie's fall in the creek? How could an 11-year-old girl just walk in her own house and insist that she had been attacked by 9 demon crows, scratches or not? And she remembered the night her parents had quarreled about her. "We had to collect 20 weed samples for a science project," she said. But she could not control the slight quiver in her voice. "Some of the places you wouldn't believe. Mouse and I got all scratched up." "Good heavens! It looks as if something got a hold of you," Mother said. "I just wish your teacher would think before she gives out these assignments." "Well, she didn't exactly tell us to go climbing along by the creek. It just seemed a good place to get all the weeds at once." Lynn thought she had done a pretty good job of being casual, but when she was examining her cheeks in the bathroom mirror, Mother came in the doorway and studied her again. Twice she opened her mouth as if to say something, but thought better of it. "What do you want?" Lynn said finally, wondering. Mrs. Morley sighed. "Lynn, I know this sounds dumb, and I certainly don't want to get those old worries of yours again, but I need to know, do those marks on your cheeks have anything to do with Mrs. Tuggle?" Lynn's heart beat faster. "What do you mean?" she asked, stalling for time. "Just what I said. Oh, I know my imagination works overtime the same as yours, but I want to know. They don't, do they?" "Don't what?" Mrs. Morley was exasperated. "Have anything to do with Mrs. Tuggle, the scratches. She didn't attack you, did she?" "Why would she do a thing like that?" Lynn asked innocently. Mother laughed, relieved. "For no reason at all, dear. I'm sorry I said a thing." She turned to go, then paused. "You know, the best thing to do, I think, is just stay away from her. I mean, no one else in the family seems affected by her as you do. I think I'd feel better if you just stayed away from up there, okay?" "Sure." Lynn waited till she heard her mother going downstairs. Then she leaned forward and stared at her face in the mirror. Could Mother be having second thoughts about the old woman? Could she have noticed things lately that disturbed her too? Was the attack by the crows the extent of the old woman's power, or were there more things yet to come? There was more to come. On Saturday, Lynn had risen early and was frying an egg for herself when the phone rang. Everyone else was sleeping. She turned off the stove and ran into the hall. Marjorie's voice came over the line, weak and far away. Lynn's first thought was that Mrs. Tuggle had abducted her and thrown her down a well. "Mouse, where are you?" "Listen, Lynn, I can't talk very loud because I don't want Daddy to hear." "What? I can hardly hear you. What's the matter? I've got to talk to you." "I'll be right over." "No, not here. Meet me in the cemetery a little after 11. I've got a piano lesson first." "Okay, I'll be there." Lynn hung up and went back out to the kitchen. The egg lay motionless in the skillet, looking up at her with its big yellow eye. It looked dead. Everything looked dead. The trees, the grass, the sky. It was a good month for dying. Silently, she ate her toast, staring out the window at the meadow and the creek beyond, and wondered what Marjorie had to tell her. She was prepared for anything. Anything at all could happen, and she wouldn't be surprised. Everything was building toward a climax. When it came, and she or Mother or Mouse or both were bodily transfigured or transported by whatever Mrs. Tuggle, the Beasleys, and the Morleys would get together and weep and wonder why they had never believed the girls in the first place. Thinking about it filled her eyes with tears, and she sniffed loudly, and she snuffed loudly. What was it that adults found so hard to accept? Father believed that absolutely everything could be explained in scientific terms. Mother, at least, said she believed that there were many things science knew nothing about, but witchcraft didn't seem to be one of them. Why was everyone so afraid even to consider it? Just because it had never happened before in this town, that they knew of anyway, didn't mean it couldn't happen now. And what did they really know about Mrs. Tuggle? That she and her husband built the house up on the hill, and that Mr. Tuggle had run his small farm until he died 15 years ago? That Mrs. Tuggle's young brother had drowned 40 years ago? That was all. Everybody knew who Mrs. Tuggle was. Everyone said hello to her. Everyone said hello when they met her on the street, but no one really knew her well. No one. For a woman who had lived here most of her life, she certainly hadn't gone out of her way to make friends. And then Mother had taken a walk up there one day, looking for a room to rent as a studio, and had fallen in love with Mrs. Tuggle's hen house. It was all those nesting boxes along the back wall, she said. Mrs. Tuggle had helped her clean and remodel it, and then, bit by bit, the old woman had crept into the Morley household by teaching Judith to sew. You want us to burn her at the stake for that? Father had asked when Lynn had told him about the crows and the way Mrs. Tuggle talked to them. What would her parents have thought if they had been along the day Lynn accused her of witchcraft, if they had seen her down by the creek themselves with the 9 crows on her outstretched arms, if they had seen the look in her eyes as she strode toward the creek the day that Mouse fell in? Could anyone really say she was normal? Perhaps not. Lynn was sure her mother would say, perhaps the old dear was a little daft in some ways, but that doesn't make her a witch, does it? Lynn stood up and dumped her dishes in the sink. Then she trotted upstairs to change into jeans and a jacket. As she passed her parents' bedroom on the 2nd floor, Mrs. Morley came out, one finger to her lips. Be extra quiet this morning, Lynn, she said. Your father didn't sleep well and feels as though he has a fever. It must be the flu. Lynn nodded and went on up to her bedroom on the top floor, where Judith's breathing came steadily from behind the curtain. She collected all her clothes and took them down to the living room so she could dress near the hot air register. 10:30. By now, Mouse would be at her music lesson. She got the comic section from the newspaper, lay down on the rug, and read them twice. Then, unable to concentrate on anything else, she put on her jacket, gloves, and a crocheted cap over her ears and set out through the garden toward the creek below and the cemetery beyond. The crows were nowhere in sight. She crossed the footbridge at the bottom of the meadow and then stared up the steep hill of the old cemetery on the other side. The ground was frozen now, and instead of the soft crunch of yellow-brown autumn grass underfoot, the earth had a crisp, crackling sound. The branches on the sycamore trees waved stark and bare against the gray sky, and Lynn wished she had worn a heavy scarf around her neck, partly to keep out of the wind, partly as protection should the crows attack her again. Somehow she did not think they would, not as long as Mouse was with her, as long as Mouse wore the ring. She wondered suddenly if that was it, if Mouse had lost the ring. What if they were meeting way out here without any protection at all? She walked quickly through the gates that hung askew and up on the grave of Mrs. Elfrida Lewis, where she sat down on the fallen tombstone. The sound of crows came from somewhere in the distance, growing louder little by little, until finally Lynn could see them in the trees beyond. She knew that Mouse was coming and leaned back to wait, her eyes on the 2 white marble angels across from her over the grave of C.L. Pritchard. Sometimes when Lynn looked at them, she was sure that one of them smiled, very slightly, just a slight curl of the lip, but she refused to believe it herself. Today the angels did not smile. They looked down with lidless eyes at the scroll they held between them and waited for Mouse to arrive. In a few minutes, the squeak of Marjorie's bicycle sounded on the other gate facing the street, followed by a clunk of metal as Mouse dumped her bike and headed across the graveyard on foot. She was still clutching her sheet music from the piano lesson. Her hair was wild and overblown, and she wore her father's old army jacket over jeans. But as soon as Lynn saw her face, she forgot all about how Marjorie looked. Mouse sank down on the ground beside her with wide, terrified eyes. Lynn, the most awful thing has happened. Mrs. Tuggle stopped by the bookstore yesterday and got talking with Daddy, and she told him how much she likes me and said how lonely she gets up there and everything. And what happened is that Daddy wants me to go up and stay with her tonight when he goes to a book auction in New York. He already told her I'd come. Lynn stared, and she was sure that her heart had stopped beating, absolutely stopped. How could he? How wrong they had been not to tell him about Mrs. Tuggle earlier. He would never listen to them now. But would he have believed them? When he hadn't even believed about the crows? She could not talk. She felt she could not even breathe. Her thoughts were smothered, as though her brain was paralyzed. And then she heard a sound that she thought was someone laughing, coming from somewhere up above. When she looked up, all she could see were the 9 black crows. But then, through a tangle of gray branches, she made out the form of a cat. And that's the end of chapter 6.